Welcome to Imperial History, the podcast where we explore the epic stories of empires that shaped the world, from their triumphant rises to their dramatic falls. I'm your host, Eric Alexander. Picture the scene. It is 323 BC, and the heart of the ancient world, Babylon, is brimming with tension. Alexander the Great, the man who had conquered everything from Greece to the Indus, is dead. His body is not even cold yet, and already the world he built, that sprawling Macedonian empire, is on the brink of chaos. There is no clear successor, no unifying force to step into his oversized sandals. All that is left is a power vacuum, and the predators are circling. The generals of Alexander's army, men who had marched beside him, fought beside him, and carried his ambitions across continents, now gathered in Babylon. They were not here to mourn. They were here to divide. This moment, this meeting, would later be known as the Partition of Babylon. Now, when you hear the word partition, you might imagine something orderly, like drawing borders on a map. But this was anything but orderly. The stakes were colossal. This was about dividing the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and the room was filled with men who had spent their lives clawing their way to the top through blood and steel. You could cut the tension with a xyphos. On one side of the room stood Perdiccas. He had been Alexander's second in command, a man entrusted with leading the cavalry, the elite strike force of the Macedonian army. Perdiccas was not just another general, he had been Alexander's right hand. And he had a plan. Perdiccas argued for the elevation of Alexander's unborn child, a child who, as of this moment, still resided in the womb of Roxana, Alexander's wife. In Perdiccas' view, this child was the legitimate heir to Alexander's empire. Perdiccas was not just fighting for power, he was fighting for the continuation of Alexander's legacy. But across the room, there was another camp and another plan. Meleager, the commander of the infantry, was not a man to be easily swayed. Meleager's argument? Forget the unborn child. The rightful ruler of the empire was already here, Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother. Aridaeus, however, was not the most obvious candidate for leadership. He was, by all accounts, mentally impaired, a man who lacked the sharpness and cunning that had defined his half-brother. But Meleager did not care. Aridaeus was a known quantity, someone who could be controlled. And control, for men like Meleager, was the name of the game. The debate between these two camps was fierce. Voices were raised, accusations hurled. And then the meeting broke down. Meleager's side, dissatisfied with the direction of the talks, staged a mutiny. The infantry rebelled, a dramatic and dangerous move in a city already teetering on the edge of chaos. Babylon itself must have felt like a powder keg. Imagine the streets filled with soldiers loyal to different factions, the tension simmering just below the surface, and everyone wondering who would make the first move. But here is the thing about mutinies. They are risky. Meleager had his moment, but Perdiccas was not a man to be trifled with. The two sides reconciled, or so it seemed. A compromise was reached. Royal authority would be divided between Alexander's unborn son and Aridaeus, now styled as Philip III. It was a solution that, on paper, might have seemed elegant. But in reality, it was a time bomb, ticking away. And then came the reckoning. Not long after this so-called reconciliation, Perdiccas moved decisively. Meleager was eliminated. And by eliminated, I mean he was killed. Along with him went others who had been identified as leaders of the mutiny. Perdiccas, it seems, had no patience for dissent. In a way, This entire episode is emblematic of what would follow in the years after Alexander's death. The Partition of Babylon was less of a settlement and more of a prelude to the wars of the Diadochi, a bloody and protracted struggle for control over the fragments of Alexander's empire. The seeds of that conflict were sown here, in this room, in this moment. Perdiccas and Meleager, the unborn heir and the impaired half-brother, they were just the opening moves in a game that would span decades and reshape the ancient world. Let us take a step back and look at who's missing from this drama. Antipater, Alexander's man in Macedonia, is sitting in Pella, the old capital. Alexander had summoned him to Babylon months earlier. Now, why would Alexander call him? Maybe it was a routine request, or maybe it was something more sinister. Antipater thought the latter. He did not go. Instead, he sent his son, Cassander. A smart move, except Cassander does not exactly fit in. This is the son of a man who had kept the Macedonian homeland secure while Alexander was out conquering Persia, and he is now surrounded by hardened veterans of Alexander's campaigns. Cassander was probably feeling pretty out of his depth. And then there is Craterus. Alexander had named him to replace Antipater as the regent of Macedonia. Craterus is on his way to Europe with 10,000 veterans. These are not just soldiers. These are the guys who had marched through deserts, crossed mountains, and bled for Alexander in places most Macedonians could not even imagine. But Craterus does not make it back to Macedonia in time. He gets as far as Cilicia when word of Alexander's death reaches him. And what does he do? He stops. He is waiting for more news, maybe more clarity, maybe just a better opportunity. Finally, there is Antigonus One-Eye. He is in central Phrygia in Anatolia. His job? Keep the route to Europe open. Now, Antigonus is not a man you ignore. He has been in the game for a while. He is a survivor. So, who is left? The big players in Babylon are gathered around Perdiccas. These are men who had been friends, rivals, and comrades in arms for years. And now they are trying to decide how to carve up an empire. The partition happens quickly, almost casually. It is ad hoc, negotiated on the spot. Ptolemy, for example, asks for Egypt and gets it. Egypt, a rich, defensible prize. And Ptolemy is not greedy. He is one of the few to realize that limiting his ambitions in the short term might get him farther in the long run. It is a lesson not all of the successors will learn. But there is another piece of business to handle: Alexander's body. For 7 days, it had lain unburied. Can you imagine that? The greatest conqueror of the age, the man who had thought himself divine, lying there as the world he had built began to unravel. The council has to decide what to do with the body, and that decision, like everything else, is political. Where Alexander is buried will matter. It is not just about honoring the dead. It is about claiming his legacy. It was decided that Alexander's body would be sent back to Pella for burial. Earlier, when his authority was weak and his position precarious, Perdiccas had agreed to marry Nicaea, the daughter of Antipater, the powerful regent of Macedon. This engagement had been a shrewd political move, a concession to a man whose influence could make or break Perdiccas's hold on power. But circumstances had changed. The chaos that followed Alexander's death had settled just enough for Perdiccas to tighten his grip on the empire. He controlled Philip III, the imperial treasury, and the army. With these levers of power firmly in hand, he began to re-evaluate the alliances that had once seemed necessary. And then came the wild card, Olympias. The mother of Alexander the Great was not just a grieving widow or a doting grandmother to the young Alexander IV. She was a force of nature, a woman whose ambition matched that of any man in Alexander's circle. Olympias proposed that Perdiccas marry Cleopatra of Macedon, her daughter and Alexander's full sister. The implications of such a union were seismic. Cleopatra's bloodline would give Perdiccas a direct connection to the Argead dynasty, the ruling house of Macedon. Another factor many would consider was the fact that Alexander IV's mother was Persian. In the eyes of many, all this would make Perdiccas more than just a regent. It would make him a legitimate heir to Alexander's throne. But this was no simple decision. Within Perdiccas's inner circle, the debate raged. On one side stood Eumenes of Cardia, the brilliant secretary-turned-general who had long been one of Perdiccas's most trusted allies. Eumenes urged Perdiccas to seize the opportunity and marry Cleopatra. To Eumenes, the dual kingship of Philip III and the young Alexander IV was a farce, a temporary arrangement masking the empire's lack of true leadership. Marrying Cleopatra, Eumenes argued, would not only solidify Perdiccas's claim to the throne, but also send a clear message to the fractious generals and satraps who were already carving out their own spheres of influence. On the other side of the debate was Alcetus, Perdiccas's brother. Alcetus's position was more cautious, even pragmatic. He reminded Perdiccas that Antipater, Nicaea's father, was still a force to be reckoned with. The old regent's health might be failing, but his influence was undiminished. Antipater had been Alexander's trusted lieutenant for decades, and his support in Macedon was indispensable. Why, Alcetus argued, risk alienating Antipater when time itself might solve the problem? Antipater would not live forever, and once he was gone, Perdiccas could assert his dominance without the baggage of a confrontation. But Perdiccas was not a man content to wait. His choice was as bold as it was dangerous. He broke off his betrothal to Nicaea and chose Cleopatra. In doing so, he openly defied Antipater and cast aside the alliance that had once bolstered his position. This was no mere slight. It was a declaration of intent. To the other generals and satraps, it was a signal that Perdiccas was no longer just a caretaker of Alexander's empire. He was aiming to rule it. At the same time that Perdiccas chose this course of action, he also summoned Antigonus, the satrap of Phrygia, to stand trial for insubordination, ostensibly for failing to support another general, Eumenes, in a campaign in Cappadocia. Antigonus sees this not as a summons to justice, but as a direct challenge to his authority. And how does Antigonus respond? He does what any shrewd, power-hungry player in this game might do. He refuses. But refusal alone is not enough. Antigonus flees to Macedon, to the court of Antipater. Antigonus does not just show up empty-handed. He brings with him explosive news, information that he knows will infuriate and galvanize Antipater and his allies. First, there is the little matter of Synane. Synane, a half-sister of Alexander, had been murdered on Perdiccas's orders to prevent another general from entering the royal family and endangering a future claim by Perdiccas. This was no minor crime. Synane's death sent shockwaves through the royal family, shaking the fragile foundation of what was left of Macedonian unity. But that is not all. Antigonus also reveals that Perdiccas, this man supposedly holding the empire together, has been plotting to elevate himself to a position that smacks of kingship. The proof? His audacious plan to marry Cleopatra, Alexander's sister. A marriage like that would not just cement Perdiccas's position, it would practically crown him as the next Alexander. And all of this, mind you, at the expense of Nicaea, who was already betrothed to Perdiccas as part of a political alliance. The reactions in Antipater's court are exactly what you would expect. Fury, outrage. Perdiccas was not just overstepping, he was threatening the balance of power that men like Antipater and Craterus had spent years trying to maintain. These were men who had just subdued Greece in the brutal Lamian War. Men who had fought to hold the empire together while carving out power for themselves. And now Perdiccas was threatening to undo it all. The news is a turning point. Antipater and Craterus shelve their plans for further campaigns in Greece. That war, for now, can wait. They turn their eyes eastward toward Asia. In 322 BC, an anti-Perdiccas alliance was formed between Antipater, Antigonus, and Craterus, but the start of the First War of the Diadochi began not with a battle, but with a corpse, the corpse of Alexander the Great. Let us pause here and think about this for a moment. Imagine a world where political power is not conferred by elections or constitutions, but by something far more visceral. In our modern times, legitimacy, the right to rule, might come from winning a democratic election or inheriting a position within a constitutional monarchy. But in the ancient world, legitimacy was often something you seized, something you justified through blood, conquest, or symbolism. In 322 BC, these generals had no elections, no referenda, and no neatly drawn laws to legitimize their claims. What they had was a desperate scramble for power in a world where perception was everything. Alexander's empire was too massive and too fragile to govern by brute force alone. To rule, you needed something more. You needed the recognition of the men who mattered, the soldiers and commanders who had fought for Alexander. You needed symbols, and symbols do not come more potent than Alexander himself. This brings us to Perdiccas. As Alexander lay dying in Babylon, it is claimed that he handed his signet ring to Perdiccas. For those who witnessed this moment, it was a tacit endorsement, a passing of the torch. Perdiccas did not claim to be king, he could not. But as the regent of Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus, Perdiccas wielded power as close to kingly as one could get without wearing the diadem. Antipater, on the other hand, anchored his legitimacy in a different way. Back in Macedon, he controlled the heartland. He had Alexander's wife, Roxana, and the infant son she bore after Alexander's death. Holding the family of the great conqueror gave Antipater a kind of leverage that Perdiccas could not ignore. And then there is Ptolemy, Alexander's trusted general. Ptolemy claimed a personal connection to Alexander, a dubious claim of kinship that might have sounded good in propaganda, but did not hold much weight among his peers. What Ptolemy lacked in familial ties, he more than made up for in audacity and cunning. This is where things get interesting. Perdiccas ordered Alexander's body to be buried in the Macedonian homeland, but as the funeral cortege made its way westward, something happened. Alexander's body was intercepted and diverted to Egypt into Ptolemy's hands. Think about that. Alexander's body was not just a corpse, it was a relic, a trophy, a physical manifestation of legitimacy. To control the body was to control the myth, the narrative. Why did Ptolemy do it? Because in a world where symbols mattered as much as swords, what better claim to power than the possession of Alexander himself? It is a bit like the legends of King Arthur and Excalibur. If you have Excalibur, you are the rightful king. If you have Alexander's body, you are the rightful heir to his empire. Or at least, that is what Ptolemy wanted people to believe. The hijacking of Alexander's body was an audacious move, and it infuriated Perdiccas. Here was Ptolemy, carving out his own power base in Egypt and defying the authority of the regent. This act was not just a slight, It was a direct challenge, and it set the stage for the first armed conflict of the Wars of the Diadochi. Perdiccas would lead an army into Egypt to confront Ptolemy, and the war, the first of many, would begin. At this point, Perdiccas knows the empire cannot survive compromise. Not with men like Antipater and Ptolemy waiting in the wings, each with their own armies, ambitions, and claims to power. These are men who fought alongside Alexander, men who conquered Persia and stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest military mind of the ancient world. But in Perdiccas' eyes, their loyalty to Alexander died with him. These men, brilliant though they are threats. And Perdiccas knows that if he is to preserve the unity of Alexander's empire, these threats must be eliminated, completely and utterly. So, Perdiccas develops a plan. The first step is to hold Asia Minor. He needs to prevent Antipater and Craterus from crossing into Asia. If they breach the Hellespont, the game is over. To secure this vital choke point, Perdiccas entrusts it to Eumenes, one of his most loyal and capable allies. Eumenes is tasked with defending the Hellespont at all costs. If successful, Perdiccas will not only block Antipater and Craterus, but also gain the breathing room needed to deal with another thorn in his side, Ptolemy. But here is where it gets interesting. Perdiccas is not just fighting a war against Ptolemy or Antipater. He is fighting a war against time. Every moment he spends dealing with one threat gives the others more time to consolidate power, recruit soldiers, and form alliances. Perdiccas knows this. He knows that his only chance is to act decisively and ruthlessly. And so, while he prepares for his campaign against Ptolemy, he starts eliminating potential threats within the empire itself. Take Archon, the satrap of Babylon. Perdiccas hears whispers of collusion between Archon and Ptolemy. That is enough for Perdiccas. He sends an army to Babylon with one goal: remove Archon. No trial, no negotiation. Just removal. The same fate awaits Laomedon, the satrap of Syria. Laomedon, too, is suspected of being in league with Ptolemy. When Perdiccas arrives in Damascus, he deposes Laomedon on the spot. And then there is Cyprus. The Cypriot kings have declared for Ptolemy. Perdiccas' response? Prepare a fleet to bring Cyprus to heel. No stone is left unturned. No potential rival is spared. What is striking here is not just the brutality, it is the logic behind it. Perdiccas understands something fundamental about power. It does not tolerate equals. The empire, in his mind, cannot be governed by a coalition of Alexander's officers. These are men who spent a decade conquering the known world. They are ambitious, brilliant, and utterly dangerous. Perdiccas knows he cannot trust them. So he does not. Instead, he systematically replaces them with hand-picked loyalists, men whose loyalty is to him, not to the memory of Alexander or to their own ambitions. As Perdiccas marched his army towards Egypt, Eumenes was on a collision course with Craterus. Each army was composed of roughly 20,000 men. Eumenes knew he could not match Craterus's phalanx in a straight-up fight. The Macedonian infantry was simply too strong, too seasoned. So what did he do? He turned to the one advantage he had, his cavalry. It was a gamble, the kind of high-stakes play that defines the careers of great generals. Eumenes' cavalry overwhelmed Craterus's forces, striking with a precision that shattered the cohesion of the Macedonian veterans. In the chaos, Craterus himself was killed, his body trampled in the melee. This was not just a military victory, it was a masterstroke of strategy. By defeating Craterus, Eumenes not only eliminated one of the most formidable commanders of the anti-Perdiccas alliance, but also ensured that no reinforcements could march to Egypt to aid Ptolemy. This brings us to the other side of the story, Egypt, where Ptolemy was fortifying his satrapy in anticipation of war. For 2 years, Ptolemy had been preparing, building defenses, stockpiling supplies, and likely cultivating loyalty among his officers and soldiers. He knew Perdiccas would come. It was only a matter of time. When Perdiccas finally arrived, he found himself facing the Nile, not just the river, but a natural barrier turned fortress. The eastern tributary was garrisoned, its banks bristling with defenders. Perdiccas, undeterred, ordered his men to construct a dam, perhaps to lower the water levels for an easier crossing. It is hard to overstate the audacity of this move. Think about it. This was not just an engineering project. It was a statement of intent, a declaration that the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, would not stand in his way. But nature has a way of humbling even the most ambitious plans. The Nile, swollen with seasonal floods, unleashed its fury. The dam was swept away, and with it, Perdiccas' hopes of a swift invasion. The river did not just break the dam, it broke the morale of Perdiccas' army. Some of his officers defected, their faith in their leader's vision shaken by the sheer force of the river's resistance. Perdiccas, however, was not finished. He turned to an age-old method of securing loyalty, rewards. Gifts and titles flowed like water, reigniting the resolve of his troops and binding them to his cause, at least for the moment. Perdiccas, true to his character, moved swiftly. His scouts had identified a ford upstream where the river could be crossed. But here was the catch. A Ptolemaic fort, bristling with defences, loomed over the crossing point. The fort was a problem, a big one. If Perdiccas wanted to get his army across, he had to take it. And for a general like him, known for his boldness, the solution was obvious: attack. At dawn, no less. Because if you were going to throw yourself into the jaws of danger, you might as well do it dramatically. So the assault began. The soldiers charged the walls, and the elephants, those hulking symbols of Macedonian dominance, smashed into the fortifications. For hours, chaos reigned. Perdiccas' men tried to scale the walls, while the defenders pushed them back. The fortress, though, was not going down without a fight. And then, to make matters worse, Ptolemy's reinforcements arrived, a whole army. Now, imagine being one of Perdiccas' men. The dawn assault had turned into a bloody stalemate. The fort's defenders were emboldened by the sight of their comrades arriving. And the elephants, those symbols of strength, they were starting to falter under the relentless pressure. Perdiccas, though, was undeterred. He ordered the assault to continue. Boldness or stubbornness? It was a fine line, was it not? The fighting dragged on, and the losses mounted. This was not a victory, it was a bloodbath. Perdiccas finally called it off, retreating back to camp. His soldiers must have been exhausted, demoralized. But they did not have long to rest, because Perdiccas was not done. And here is where things started to unravel. Perdiccas, still determined to cross the river, found another ford. This one was less guarded. It was risky, but Perdiccas thrived on risk. He sent a contingent of his army forward, leading them himself. They made it to the middle of the river, an island surrounded by rushing water. For a moment it seemed like the gamble might pay off. But then disaster struck. The river rose. The elephants, so effective on solid ground, sank into the mud. Soldiers, weighed down by their armor, were swept away by the current. The river became a death trap. Crocodiles, yes, crocodiles, began to take their share of the feast. By the time Perdiccas ordered a retreat, it was already too late. Most of his men on the island drowned trying to get back. The losses were staggering, 2,000 dead, including some of his most trusted officers. This was not just a tactical failure, it was a catastrophe, and the army knew it. The men were tired, angry, and losing faith in their commander. Perdiccas, the regent of Alexander's empire, was starting to look less like a leader and more like a liability. And here is where the human element kicks in. The whispers, the muttered complaints, the side glances among the officers. Soldiers are loyal, sure, but only to a point. Perdiccas had led them into Egypt on a campaign that seemed doomed from the start. He had failed to secure a single decisive victory, failed to deliver the glory or the loot that Macedonian soldiers expected. In the end, it was not an external enemy that brought Perdiccas down. It was his own men, his officers, Pithon, Antigonus, and Seleucus, saw the writing on the wall. Maybe they were disillusioned with his leadership. Maybe they were working with Ptolemy all along. Either way, Perdiccas was murdered, probably in the summer of 320 BC, a mere 3 years after Alexander's death. And here is the kicker. One day after Perdiccas' assassination, news arrived of Eumenes' stunning victory at the Battle of the Hellespont. Eumenes had defeated Craterus, one of the most powerful generals in the empire. If that news had arrived just a day earlier, Perdiccas' authority might have been restored. Imagine what could have been. With the empire's most dangerous rival defeated, Perdiccas might have consolidated his power, emerged as Alexander's true successor, and founded a new dynasty. The first war of the Diadochi may have ended with the death of Perdiccas, but many more are soon to follow.